Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and looking at Reti's analysis of those games. We are on game number 29, continuing to look at the games of Emanuel Lasker. And in this game his opponent is the famous Capablanca. And this is quite a famous game where Lasker beats Capablanca. Now in the game we have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 going into the Ruy Lopez, a6, and now bishop takes c6 going into the exchange Ruy Lopez. Now Reti offers quite a bit of analysis to this opening. He actually offers it before the game even starts, but seeing as this is how the game continues, I will offer it now. Now, first of all, Reti looks at the b takes c6 potential, and he says that after b takes c6, you still haven't got this option of winning the pawn due to queen to g5, attacking the knight and this pawn, and even queen e7 attacks a knight and the other pawn. After something like d4, d6, things are going to get a bit hairy. You know, something like this would be a potential option. But Reti gives queen g5 as the reason why white can't just win this pawn. However, after b takes c6, Reti does say that a potential option is d4 straight away, where after e takes d4, queen takes d4, that white is potentially okay here because this queen on d4 is very centralized. It controls a lot of squares. It stops black from being able to develop calmly, and it also it can't really be kicked away that easily. Obviously, there's no knight coming to c6 to kick it away. One of the advantages of this c6 pawn is it allows d5 pawn break potentially. But if you just push c5 now, then you're sort of taking away the whole advantage of this pawn. You can just retreat the queen and be completely fine. This is just a better game for white. And so he says after this bishop takes c6, usually black would capture with the d pawn. And now very often you would play d4. After e takes d4, queen takes d4, going into a queen trade. Knight takes d4. In this position, white very often, this is quite an in-depth position. So first of all, Reti looks at the pawn structure. So we've got 4 pawns here versus 3. So this means if white advances these pawns, then all white needs to do is trade 1 pawn of white for 1 pawn of black's, and they will be left with a single pass pawn that could potentially queen. Obviously, which pawn you're left with depends on how you push and which exchanges you make. However, black hasn't really got this option. If white simply puts their pawn on c3 and a3, then black can never queen. White can put their pawns here and just simply stay there, and white won't initiate any exchanges. They'll take back if they have to, but they won't initiate any exchanges, because any exchanges will stop black from with the pawns here. If white doesn't initiate any exchanges but just simply recaptures, then black can never queen these pawns. Black can't break through then. An alternative setup Reti gives is potentially putting a pawn on b3. So you have a2, b3 and c2. However, he says that you have to be a bit more careful here because if you do make any captures, like for instance, if this pawn comes down here and you capture it, it may be a bit more awkward, and you may no longer be able to blockade the black pawns. Now he says that because of this, because white has the better pawn structure, that if it was just a king and pawn endgame, then you'd expect white would win this quite easily. you'd think this would be winning for white if it was just king and pawn endgame. And therefore, white is very keen to try and trade off all of the pieces if they can. However, black has a bishop pair to sort of compensate for this ruined structure. So black wants to try and avoid some of the exchanges if possible, and try and make use of their bishop pair. Reti does also comment that if the black may want to try and trade off something like, say, this knight for this knight, because then he'll be left with a bishop pair against a bishop and knight. So if he's left with if white just has these two pieces and black has the bishop pair, then we'll see the same thing that we see quite often in the Steinitz games, where black will try and place their pawns on dark squares, limiting this bishop and hopefully removing outposts for this knight, whilst black's bishops have a bit more freedom. And likewise, Reti also comments that if white manages to exchange off one of these bishops, then white will very likely place their pawns in the queenside formation opposite to the colour of the remaining bishop. So if black has the light square bishop on the board, but no dark square bishop, I can't do a cross. If black just has a light square bishop, then these pawns would be like this on the dark squares. If black just has a dark square bishop, then these pawns will be like this on the light squares, essentially removing counterplay of this bishop. Now, in this position, Reti also comments that this variation is very often a draw. White plays for simplifying down, whereas black needs to try and play a bit more energetically with his bishops. But generally speaking, it's nearly always a draw. And Reti comments that the choice of Lasker to go into this variation was probably a bit of a genius one, because Capablanca was leading in this tournament, and Lasker is one of the strongest opponents in this tournament, so Capablanca probably would have been quite happy with a draw in this game, because he may well have then been able to win the tournament a lot easier. So why then does Lasker go into a game, an opening, which is known to draw? And Reti comments that when you are in the mindset of trying to draw a game, if you're trying to get a draw, then it can be very difficult to switch out of that mindset. However, in this exchange variation, black has to switch out of that mindset. Black's got the bishop pair. Black needs to be trying to push for a win and not just simplification and a draw. And that's why Reti comments that Lasker chose this opening variation, because Lasker thought that Capablanca would probably try and play a bit more passively, a bit quieter. Capablanca would be playing more for a draw rather than more energetically. And that's why Lasker was quite comfortable going into an opening which is known to be drawish against an opponent who wants to draw. It's a very psychological choice. Now in the game, Capablanca plays bishop to d6. Reti comments that this is probably the best square for the bishop. It's very active here, and if white does ever exchange off this bishop, after c takes d6, then black's pawn structure is fixed. It's no longer got the doubled pawns. Now Lasker responds with knight c3. We see knight to e7, castles, castles, and now f4. And this has been seen time and time again. Well, perhaps not time and time again. This f4 pawn push is quite common in this variation. Rook to e8 is the response. Here, Reti comments that this again was perhaps a bit passive. Perhaps the more energetic, as Reti comments, bishop c5 is better, pinning the knight to the king. However, we see rook to e8, and now we see knight to b3, stopping this bishop c5 maneuver. Now here we see f6, and this f6 move is Reti described as being very essential, really. It has to be played to stop any potential e5 pawn pushes. So we see f6, and now f5. And Reti says that this is, at first glance, quite a surprising move, because This pawn is now a backwards pawn, it can no longer really advance, and white is giving up this e5 square. However, he comments that once you look a bit further into it, it sort of makes sense. These two pawns here are limiting this black bishop on c8, and it's also limiting this knight. The knight has less squares it can jump to. In fact, it can't jump anywhere at the moment. And also, these pawns are on light squares, and black has a dark square bishop. So white may want to, well, having pawns on the opposite colour square as your bishop is always better, because it gives your bishop more freedom. And Reti also comments that this does give up the e5 square, but this pawn also controls e6, so actually, is this e6 square compensation for the e5 square? And it's up to white to prove that the e6 square is compensation. Now here we see b6, and Capablanca wants to develop his bishop to d7. Now Reti comments that this is probably a mistake because the bishop on d7 is no longer controlling this e6 square. He says that perhaps bishop d7 followed by rook e8 may be bishop b7 followed by rook d8 is probably the better move. And if we have bishop f4 like we saw in the game, bishop takes, knight c8 can then potentially go to d6, and black's got a bit more activity here. But instead Capablanca plays b6, going for bishop to b7. And actually it's worth pointing out, Reti also comments on g5, because this was apparently considered. Because in the game we saw bishop to f4, attacking this bishop, hoping for a trade of bishops, whereas g5 secures this bishop permanently on d6, because bishop c4 is no longer an option. And if white were to take en passant, then knight takes g6, rook takes f6, bishop to e5, rook f3 to, then black equalizes. So after this exchange, rook can take on f3, but black isn't going to stay a pawn down because of this bishop e5 move, removing the defender of this pawn, which is why rook f3 is played, because it just stops you doubling your pawns. So Reti comments that g5 was an alternative, or bishop d7 was another alternative, followed by rook to d8, and sorry, bishop d7 followed by rook to e8 and something like knight to here. But instead we have b6, intending bishop to b7. Now here we have bishop to f4, bishop b7, and Reti comments that this was another slight mistake. Capablanca probably should have exchanged bishops, and the reason for this is after Lasker exchanges bishops, which is what happened in the game, c takes d6. Black's pawn structure is fixed. However, whilst black doesn't have the doubled pawns, the pawn on d6 is now a permanent weakness. And look at black's pieces; they're not very active currently, and due to that, this d6 weakness is sort of magnified. Black has less activity, he's less able to defend it. White has far more activity, far more potential options, so white can exploit any weaknesses far easier. Now after c takes d6, we saw knight to d4, rook a to d8, then knight to e6, exploiting this weakened e6 square that we spoke about earlier. Now rook to d7 was played, rook a to d1, and now knight to c8, rook to f2, b5, rook f to d2. So you see how Lasker maneuvered his rooks to double up on this weak pawn here. Rook d to rook d to e7. Note that this pawn can't be taken without you losing the exchange. One of the reasons for this knight c8 move. And now b4. So here Capablanca probably wanted to play something like c5, which would free up the black position quite nicely. This bishop is suddenly very powerful. It's eyeing this weakened pawn, and black has a backwards pawn here, but white has a backwards pawn here, and it's not too sure. White's better here, but black's managed to gain some degree of counterplay. And Lasker has no reason to allow that counterplay. He plays b4, stopping any c5 moves. Now here we see king f7, a3, bishop to a8, king to f2, so centralizing the kings, rook to a7, g4. And now this is a key point that Reti stops and talks about, really. He says that we see that white has the advantage. White has the space advantage. So white is restricting black's position. Well, let's first of all actually look at the center. The center is closed. There's no real action going on in the center. There's no real breakthroughs that are going to happen in the center either. So what we know about play when the center is closed, you can either completely open it up, or more commonly when you control a center or the center is closed, you would attack on the flanks. And we also know from past games that when the center is closed and you have a positional advantage, that the attacks on the flanks are far stronger. Here, the attack on the flank would be far, far stronger for white, because white has the space advantage, the more powerful knight, and the center is closed, which allows him to do that. Whereas black has less space and less activity, so any attacks on the wings by black are going to be far less effective. Now here we see that white is starting to try and get some counterplay on the king side. It's going to need some preparation, quite a bit more preparation, but white is going for that counterplay on the king side. Black, however, is hoping to try and break through on the queen side. Black's rook is posted on a7 to try and open up black's rook's on his a7, so hopefully black can push these pawns and open up the a file and have full control of it. However, Reti comments that this is a very common mistake that we see. In the game, you see that black succeeds in opening this a file, but has to immediately retreat the rook back to the center and isn't able to keep control of this a file. And towards the end of the game, Lasker is able to control this open file himself. And Reti comments that this is a very common mistake you see quite often. When one player is far more restricted and has far less space, you very often see that player will try and break free and try and open some lines, try and get more space. And that's not a bad plan in itself. However, Reti comments that you have to be very careful when you do that, because opening, as we will see in this game, opening lines doesn't mean you are opening lines for yourself. You can also open lines for your opponent. You can open lines that can help your opponent attack your king. And even if you do open a line, you have to be able to utilize it for some form of a counterattack. There's no point playing a whole bunch of moves to open this a file if white can just gain a massive initiative in the center against your king. So, Reti comments, you have to be very certain that when you try and open some lines and free up your position, that you are able to use those lines to gain a counterattack, to divert some of your opponent's pieces, to the defense of the counterattack you're getting. Because if you're not able to, then your opponent can then use those lines against you and use those lines in their own attack on your position. And we see how Lasker actually does this. So here we see Lasker play g4. Now, Capablanca starts with h6 to try and delay any kingside play. We see rook to d3, a5, and we see Capablanca starting this push on the queen side. Here, h4, a takes b4, a takes b4, and Lasker had no issue with this file opening. And now Capablanca's opened the file for his rook, but his rook has to immediately retreat to e7. You know, if his rook tried to get active, I mean, for starters, the rook can't go to a1 or a2. So let's say his rook tried to, it also can't go to a4 because of the knight. Let's say it tried to go to a3 to gain some counterplay along the third rank. But then g5 can come, and after something like h6 g5, h6 g5, Capablanca's a bit stuck. If he was to take here, then rook h1 would be coming. Sorry, not rook h1 immediately. Knight would come to here, and after the king moves, something like knight g1, rook g1 will come, and we see that black has a very weak pawn here. White's knight is centralized, and if white can take this pawn, then white's just going to have a very easy pass pawn. And this rook looks sort of active, but black's pieces are just sort of out of play. They're all on the edge of the board. They're not really doing much. Likewise, that was also happened after f takes g5, knight takes. Let's say black didn't take. Let's say they just moved the bishop. Well, g6 check is coming, and this is just quite deadly. Something like king g8 will be met by rook h1, and yeah, this is game over. So the threat is rook to h7, potentially trying to take here. Let's say you do knight to e7, again rook d to h3, just doubling up, threatening to come straight to h8. So this is lost, really. So because of that, black couldn't really use this open file. Black had to bring his rook back to the middle. And in fact, I'm looking at chess.com's computer, and that actually just gives rook takes e6 as the top move, just giving up the exchange. But instead we see rook to e7, king to f3, bringing the king up, rook to g8, king f4, g6, now rook to g3, and now we see g5 check. And now we see again white's able to now open up the H file and potentially control it. Now Reti comments that perhaps g takes f5 would have been a bit better because it would potentially open the g file, which may be a bit, it's not good for because white can control it, but it may be a little bit better for than the continuation of having the H file opened. And note, if white captures here, then after this d pawn push, black's problems are starting to black's problems are starting to disappear. You know, the rook has got a semi-open file, there's a potentially weak pawn here, and black's starting to get a bit more space advantage as well. So black's problems are starting to disappear. It's still winning for white 100%, but it's the lesser of the evils. But instead Capablanca plays g5 check. And here we see king to f3. He doesn't take back. We now see knight to b6, intending knight to c4, a nice little outpost square for the knight. And now we see h takes g5. h takes g5, rook to h3. It's worth noting this pawn is hanging, but after rook takes d6, this is still winning for black, but black can play perhaps rook to h8 and knight to c4 and have a potentially more stable position than in the game. So black would have black would have compensation for this pawn. So instead, Lasker plays rook to h3. Now we see rook to d7, defending this pawn. And Reti does comment that knight to c4 may be perhaps a more logical move defending this pawn, but it loses on the spot. Rook h7, check, king to e8, and now rook to a1 is coming. And this is just deadly. Obviously you can't take, because after this you lose the rook. Well, no, you're just down a bishop. You've exchanged a pair of rooks and lost a bishop. So after something like rook a1, let's say black just played bishop b7, stopping any rook a8 moves. Well then, knight c7 check, king d7, rook takes here, king takes, and rook to a7 pinning the bishop, and black would lose material no matter what. If black tried to defend the bishop, then knight a6 would come, attacking the rook. The bishop's pinned. This is just game over. So that's why knight c4 may appear a bit more logical. You know, this rook is a bit more active here than it is on d7, although it doesn't make a huge difference. But the knight, certainly, you want your knight on c4, ideally. But this just loses by force. So that's why rook to d7 was played instead. Now here we have king g3, and Reti comments that this was a very precise move. It was very well thought out. White wants the e5 pawn bush, but note how the king is on the same diagonal as the bishop. So for this to be possible without tactical complications coming into play against Lasker, Lasker simply moves his king to the side. Now here we see king to e8, rook d to h1, bishop to b7, and now e5. Now after d takes e5, it's a pawn sacrifice. We then have knight to e4, knight to d5, and now we have knight to c5. And now we see the idea of this combination. And here black has to give up the exchange with bishop c8. If they instead try to just not lose material, then after this we have a fork and black just loses the rook. So now we see the entire idea of e5, making room for the white knight on e4, where the pawn was, and then forking the rook and the bishop. So in the game, and then forking the rook and the bishop with this knight, because we need this knight to control the d6 square. So in the game we see bishop to c8, giving up the exchange. We have knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, and now rook to h7, straight away putting a rook on the 7th rank. Now here we see rook to f8, potentially trying to perhaps challenge this, and also trying to stop any potential checks. But now we see rook to a1, and Lasker's now using that open queen rook file, the open a file, to his advantage. Now here we see king to d8, rook a8 check, bishop to c8, and then knight to d6, and here Capablanca resigned. The bishop's under attack twice, and there's no real way to defend it. The only possible move that might defend is knight to e7, but even then after rook to a7, this knight's then attacked twice. And let's say the knight moves out the way, after knight takes c8, the king can't take back, because that's just mate. So there we have it. That's game number 29, and a rare end game that Capablanca lost. And we see again some of the psychology of Lasker's play. He chose a drawish variation where he knew Black would have to play very energetically, except he knew Black wouldn't be playing very energetically because Black was going for a draw. And we know that Capablanca can play energetically. Capablanca is a fantastic player. He's more than capable of playing energetically and playing this exchange variation very well, except Lasker suspected that he wouldn't play the exchange variation very well. And I believe actually after this game, after this loss, Capablanca then lost to Tarash. He was sort of a bit tilted, I guess. And Lasker went on to win this tournament. So there we have it. That's another psychological game of Lasker. Sort of a bit of a lesson in choosing your openings, but also a lesson in making the most of passive play, and also quite an instructive game on the end game as well. And we also learned a new opening whilst we're at it. So we have it. I hope you enjoyed this game. If you did, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.